This presentation on scope and applicability in ISO 9001-2015 comes to us from Joana dos Guimarães Sá, the co-convener of the ISO 9001 Auditing Practices Group of ISO TC 176, the technical committee responsible for ISO 9001. Joana is the Executive Development Director for APSR, a certification, education, and training firm focused on the actions organizations and people can take to create more sustainability. She is also an experienced auditor in several fields, representing IQNet at ISO TC 176 SC2 and participating also in ISO TC 279, the group that wrote the recently published ISO 56002 Innovation Management System Guidance. And with that, take it away, Joana.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for this invitation to speak a little bit about scope and applicability, our new paper on APG group. First, I'm going to do a brief introduction on what are the auditing practices group, why we do them, and then I will talk in more detail about the news and the changes in the papers of scope and applicability. Well, we're talking about auditing organizations of all kinds, small, big, in every part of the world, in every sector of the economy, in the society, in industry, in services, in governments, everywhere around the globe. Auditors do this using a standard that aims to apply to all of them, ISO 9001. ISO 9001 defines the requirements of a standard of a quality management system and aims to apply to any kind of organization. So it's a very generic standard. The process to conduct an audit, it's also a generic process. It's defined in ISO 17021 for certification audits and in ISO 1911 for all audits. And there are qualified persons with very different backgrounds in terms of experience, education, skills, culture. So very diverse range of people realizing these audits. Then, the challenge, it's that the auditors community ensures what it's proposed to ensure, that is to reach valid and consistent conclusions about the organization. And when we say valid and consistent, that in principle, auditors reach the same conclusions, auditing the same organizations in the same circumstances. So we want to reach valid conclusions about the conformity system with the standard requirements and about the organization is reaching the intended outcomes of ISO 9001. That is, that we could evaluate the organization and the organization can demonstrate its ability to provide consistently the products and services that meet the requirements and that aims to enhance customer satisfaction. That is to go to the intended results that are in the scope of the standard itself. So this is a big challenge because everything is generic and we have then to look at the standard and to look how it applies to every specific context. That's why ISO TC 176, the technical committee that is responsible for publishing ISO 9001, created Auditing Practices Group that is now known as ISO 9001 APG. Auditing Practices Group basically publishes papers, and these papers are freely available at ISO TC 176 homepage. I give you the link here in case you want to explore them. They are free to download and to be used. What do we do in this paper? It is to address these challenges in auditing, providing good examples, ideas, explanations on audit practices, calling attention to common mistakes. Many times some papers are initiated because people start to talk about a bad practice, something that should be clarified, how to prevent these common mistakes, and sharing practices on new topics. We are an informal group. We are drawn from the experts that attend ISO TC 176, and mainly the people participating are auditors, auditors from certification bodies, internal auditors of organizations, people that look at the standard in the audit perspective, and also from the International Accreditation Forum. The guidance is primarily aimed at quality management system auditors. Of course, consultants and quality practitioners, quality managers can use it evenly to their internal audit programs, and it's not aimed to be definitive. There are many people proposing papers, and there are different views. The papers also reflect this idea that there are many people auditing different sectors that encounter different problems, that work in different countries and in different regions. So it's not definitive. It may not be applicable to all situations. It's just to share experience, to share our practice, what we think is good practice. In no case it's intended to be used as an interpretation of the standard, as a specified requirement, as a benchmark or an audit criteria. And this is very important. Very important to say is also that this is an informal group, and like that, the papers are not subject to an endorsement process, a formal endorsement process in ISO. They are not sent to the ISO members for voting or commenting. They do not represent an official position. So you can use this information the way you like it, and you're very welcome. You can download it for educational and communication purposes. It is free. You must respect, of course, the intellectual property origin and state they come from ISO. And of course, the ISO group, the ISO Auditing Practices Group, does not take any responsibility for errors, omissions, or other liabilities that may arise from the provision or subsequent use of such information. This group was born a long time ago, and the need for the group was back in 2000, when process approach was introduced in ISO 9000, and there was auditing companies felt the need to clarify what was an audit following the process approach, and in many times, and this is still, many of the recommendations that was done by that time are still valid and important for auditors, either old auditors, either the new generation of auditors that is coming. This was convened by Alexis Vakovic until his retirement in 2006. And as it was a success and papers were very welcome, accreditation also made its accreditation auditing practices group. The papers are also available at the same website. And now there is more recently the ISO 14001 Auditing Practices Group. And maybe you know other papers will follow for other management systems. Everyone in the group can make a proposal, can make a text. The peers will revise it, will say if they agree or not, will make improvements, and then it gets published. We like to be driven by our customers, people that read us, people that have problems to take care. So if you have questions and challenges, you go to the website, you will see this information, but I leave you here. You should send an email to Charles Corey, that is supporting us as secretary of this group, and the questions will come to us and we will try to address them. So now that we made this introduction on EPG, I'm going to talk you on scope and applicability. And one of the first, I believe ISO 9001:2015 introduced a lot of clarifications on scope, but the truth is that there are too many scopes, and many times it's very difficult for newcomers especially to understand the difference. There's the scope of the standard, the scope of the quality management system, the scope of the certificate, and the audit scope. So it's important that these are different scopes, of course, but they have interrelations and they impact each other's and they impact the audit process. And on the other hand, now in scope of the quality management system, where it used to speak about exclusions, we talk about applicability. That's a new concept. And we need to be aware of the implications of this new requirement. So let's just briefly talk about the scopes. ISO 9001 scope defines the subject of the standard, tells what the standard is about. She's defining requirements for a quality management system where the organization needs to demonstrate that it can provide the products and services that it claims to provide, and that he aims to improve to enhance the customer satisfaction of the client. In clause 4.3, we are already in the requirements. We are already defining what the organization needs to do to determine the scope of the QMS, to what is the applicability to which applies the quality management system. And it also considers the possibility that some requirements that are in the scope of the standard may not be applicable. Then we have the certificate scope. This belongs to those companies that decide to get certified by a third party and derives for the quality management scope, and is used to communicate the certification status of the organization to relevant interested parties. So it's the outcome of the certificate. The certification will be a certificate that will tell which is the organization that is certified, where it works, and what it does. So it's very relevant for the organization. And finally, we have the audit scope that defines the extent and boundaries of an audit. Audit is a sampling process. We never audit all the organization, all the things that happen. We always do a sample, and we have to define the extent and boundaries of an audit. And of course, to understand the scope of the QMS is critical to define the audit scope. The audit scope includes a description of the physical locations where we are going to do the audit, also the virtual locations that are more and more frequent. Which functions do we need to audit? Which organizational units? What are the activities, the processes, and the time period that we are going to cover? So in brief, these are the 4 scopes. When do we audit the scope? Well, it's fundamental for audit preparation to start to understand what are we going to audit? What does this organization do, and where, and what are the processes she has in place? And then after opening meeting, you start addressing the scope. I think, it's not mandatory, but of course it's obvious that you need to start discussing with the organization what they do, what processes they have. And then during the audit, you're continuously revising and understanding the scope, what it applies, and what are the boundaries. requirements related to scope are defined in clause 4.3. They say we have to determine the boundaries and applicability of the KMS scope, and we have to state the organization, the types of products and services covered. When we say the types of products and services covered, we don't want a full list or the catalog of the company's services or products. We want a generic description of the products that can give a correct idea of what the organization does. The boundaries can be physical, can be organizational or other, and limit the application of the KMS. And in accordance with the context, these boundaries can include the processes, the sites, the departments, the divisions, the functions, the products and services itself. To define the scope, the starting point is what are the products and services that are to be included in the KMS. That is what the organization needs to determine. Which products and services do I need? Do I want to include in my KMS? And for these products and services, what are my processes? What do I do? What am I responsible? I may not be doing them, but I might be responsible for these processes to deliver them. And finally, once you have what they are applicable to, what the processes we have, we need to know what supports these processes. What are the physical locations, the infrastructure, what are the resources, what is the organization? Where are the boundaries of my quality management system? And of course, the auditor has to evaluate this. For most of the companies, the quality management system scope is self-evident. An organization, as a reason, exists to provide a certain product or certain services, and the KMS covers all the organization and all the processes to provide them. So that is the most common situation. And it's straightforward. But in some others, this can be much more complex. And for example, when there is outsourcing, when there is a wide complexity and diversity of products and services, multiple site organizations where maybe what the organization does at a certain site, it's not the same what it does at another. Service centers where there's a complexity of services. Organizations that makes the service at customer premises, where the boundaries, the physical boundaries become more complex. Share facilities, an organization that works in a place where other organizations work, projects that are limited by time, etc. In this situation, KMS scope needs to be carefully evaluated. And the auditor needs to be sure that the organization evaluated the scope correctly. Let us remind, and this is very important because context is a new introduction in 2050, that Section 4.3 starts to tell us that we need to consider issues raised from the context of the organization. That is, what are the relevant requirements from relevant interested parties, including customers, the results of risk-based approach, the commercial and contractual considerations, statutory and regulatory requirements, etc. So there's a logic. The scope determination comes from the outputs of the context analysis. So auditors should follow the trade from outputs to the determination of KMS scope and boundaries. Remember that it's the responsibility of the organization to determine the scope, and she needs to clearly demonstrate that she considered all relevant issues that were identified. And one of the first things that is more critical is the definition of organization itself, because as I say, for most of the organizations, it's a legal entity that gets certified for the products and services it provides. But by definition, an organization it's a person or group of people that has its own functions, responsibilities, authorities, and relationships to achieve its objectives. And for the purpose of the KMS, and according to the ISO directives, it can be a sole trader, a company, a corporation, an enterprise, an authority. It can be a partnership. It can be an association, it can be governmental or not, and it can be a part of another organization or a combination between organizations. And it can be public or private. And so this brings that sometimes the organization is not the obvious name of the entity or of the legal entity that we are talking about, and maybe more complex. So for the purposes of the KMS, the organization is the one that supports the system. So to give you a quick example, we have company A. There's a top management, there are several departments. But in the end, for the purposes of the KMS, imagine that only certain business units are going, and the services and products provided are going to apply the KMS. So there are other parts of the organization that are not included in the system. For the purposes of certification, what is certified is that organization, this red bubble that I designed here, the other parts are excluded. We might have relations with other parts, but it's not all the company, although, so in other situations, it can be a combination of different companies where there are partnerships, and we have to understand these organizational boundaries of the KMS, and even because they impact a lot either the certification scope or the KMS scope, and then especially the audit scope. So if the organization is part that supports the KMS, is part of a larger entity or a combination between different entities, we need this would have been identified in the context of the situation. When the organization analyzes its internal and external issues, it should have identified that she's incorporated in another bigger organization, and the auditor needs to check if this was done and what are the interrelations with this bigger organization. And this is important for the audit itself, because we need to understand what is outside the scope of the KMS on the larger entity that may affect or support the KMS, and how it's handled in the system and how it can be evaluated, because the organization can address this in several ways, different ways. It can include these functions in the quality management system. Only, for example, I'm thinking about human resources that are at a corporate level, and we have only a business unit that has the system. So maybe we can go to corporate level, human resources department, and audit the processes related to people. Maybe they are addressed in other way, like a service provider. Maybe in other situations of the organization, we take, for example, this unit that produces a component like an external provider, and we apply basically control of externally provided services. So we need to understand how these interrelations are defined. So once again, follow the trail from context outputs. So in scope, we need to understand applicability, products and services and processes to deliver them, and boundaries. They are important for the certificates, for both certificate scope and audit scope, but boundaries are more critical for determination of audit scope, for a good preparation of the audit, and applicability is very critical for the certificate scope. So now that we covered the aspects of the scope of the QMS, the one that the organization established, let's talk a little bit about the certificate scope. Certification plays an important role in contractual and regulatory fields, and it's a third-part verification of the quality management system of the organization. So usually the scope of the certificate derives from the QMS scope, and in many situations is the same. So the role of the auditor is to verify that the scope statement of the certificate will reflect truthfully what the organization provides and that is covered by the quality management system, including the location stated in the certificate. One of the most important things an auditor needs to check at the audit are the misleading scope statements, because phrasing is very important, and we want to be honest, to reflect honestly what the organization does, and not giving the idea that the organization is things that are really not covered by the QMS. So that would be a very poor service to the organization and to its customers. So one of the things that is important, for example, examples of basic misleading scope statements. You cannot, ISO 9001 is a management system. You cannot state that in the scope statement that the products comply with standard X or Y, because that would give the idea that we are also making product or service certification, and we're not. They are separate things. So you cannot add a reference to a normative document. The other thing is to build a scope that is too broad or too vague and gives an incorrect impression of a vague impression of what the organization does. For example, construction. Of course, in many cases, in very big organizations, they will have a license to construct everything, and they handle everything from roads to bridges to houses to. But in many other cases, they are even not authorized to do everything. So we need to be sure that we don't write the scope in a vague manner to give the idea that they can do everything. And construction is just an example. It could be applied to other sectors as well. The other is when the organization claims to have a very big product portfolio, and in the end we go to the audit and we can't see that she really has those services in place or those products in place. Remember that according to the scope of the standard, this is for organizations that want to demonstrate they can provide the products and services they are telling. So we can't put in the scope a list of products or services that in fact we couldn't see the organization has the ability to provide. The other thing that we have to be careful is that when people want to put claims in the certificate, like same-day home repairs, and you can have, okay, maybe this is their argument, their sales argument, but you can't put that in the scope. You cannot put marketing sentences like I have the cheapest and best product. So it's clearly misleading and not even in the scope of the audit and of the work. So, to avoid confusion and enable an identification of what has been certified, the scope should define the types of products and services provided, the organization's main operational processes, in what part of the value chain is she's designing, she manufactures, she produces, she provides the services, she packages, she makes transportation, etc. So the main process that she has, not a description of all its processes, and the related sites where these activities are performed. Of course, there are several rules that have to be applied, and this is not the purpose to refer to these rules, but just to give an idea that what a scope needs to be done. There's an important thing to be referred here. Sometimes organizations have the flexibility to define its scope. That's why they may not apply to everything or to the whole organization or not. But sometimes the way they write, they have the freedom, they know what they are providing. And sometimes what they do already defines the main process. For example, if you're an architect firm, of course you do design and development. So it's perfectly correct to say architecture services. You don't need to do design and development of architecture because the name by itself is totally clear that for what the organization is about. Then there's this case where some organizations choose to certify only a part of the products or services provided. And this is common and this is allowed because organizations need to have the flexibility to go to their needs. Maybe they don't need to certify everything they do. They have demands on a certain part, or maybe they want to go with a certain pace. So this is acceptable and allowed if the types of products and services are covered in the KMS scope, of course, and if we can demonstrate that the organization is able to provide these products and services in accordance with the applicable requirements. While they are excluding other products and services, they are excluding certain processes, locations, or even parts of the organization. So this picture will show we, for example, us going from the organization. So we have a big company that might only have applied the KMS to a part of the organization and might even decide that the certificate scope is even smaller than this. As long as the certificate scope is included in the KMS and the boundaries of the KMS are very well defined, there's no problem with this. I give you now some examples that are common with different certificates and KMS scopes, and that also give you an idea of the need sometimes to have different scopes. For example, think about a catering company that provides meals in canteens, either in schools, industrial plants, service organizations. And this infrastructure is the property of its client, and they can't control everything, and they don't need to apply to get certified for everything. And even certain infrastructure is not the conditions to be certified, and they can't control it. So they have a KMS that has its processes to provide this food, and that is applicable to all the company because they need to have a KMS to everything. They need to comply with requirements, legal requirements, but they choose to certify only the places, defined locations or for the organizations that want to be sure the QMS is certified or that they think it's important to demonstrate certification. This is a very common situation. Another situation is, for example, a local government that, for example, only chooses because it can't certify everything. It cannot apply the system initially to everything. So it starts with things that seem more relevant. For example, it starts with the building licenses department or the provision of water. And even this system can be enlarging to other services, and they are not certified. Another example, and also very common, is in hospitals where it's very common that they don't apply the QMS to all specialities and they start with some. Mainly they want to improve, they want to start improvement or consistency in certain services, and they don't apply to all services. Many industrial organizations only choose to certify some product lines where they have specific requirements from the clients, and other new services are not included. And many big organizations also start to implement the system to certain products and services or certain sites, and then gradually they enlarge the scope. Now, moving from certificate scope and QMS scope, let's explore a little bit the audit scope. As I told you previously, understanding the quality management system and the certificate scope is an audit activity, is part of the audit. The certificate scope, if you have a third-party audit, of course, if not, no. But understanding this is also critical to define the audit scope itself and then to plan the audit. Of course, the audit scope needs to be consistent with the audit program and the audit objectives, and we're not going to follow the audit process as it is given in 1911, but just to remember that the audit scope comes also from the requirements they are defined. But it includes what are the locations that are going to be sampled, which organizational functions are we going, which activities and processes, what are the resources we need to check, and the time period covered, remembering that the audit is always a sampling process. But to understand the QMS allow us to understand the boundaries of the audit. Where is the information for the evidences we need to collect? What is outside the organization? If the system does not apply to every part of an entity, what will be outside? In which processes or locations are certain aspects of the standards to be evaluated? What is out of reach from direct observation? For example, are there virtual locations? Are there people working at home offices and linked to projects, and we need to use remote techniques? This has to do with the places, and this is all very important to be considered to define the audit scope. Another point is very important, as integrated audits are more common. We audit with the same auditors or with a competent team with all the competencies, several management systems. It is not obvious that the scope of a quality management system for the same organization is the same scope they defined for the environmental management system or for the health and safety management system. And so to understand the difference, if there are differences in scope, it is critical, even because the requirements related to scope in other standards are not the same and may not be so flexible as the ISO 9001 requirements. Another important consideration, as we said previously, is when there is outsourcing. And outsourcing is very frequent. In the end, outsourcing is something we use. It may be considered as something we used to do internally, and once in a moment we decided to put externally, and in the end, it's an externally provided process or service. And nevertheless, the organization that has a QMS is responsible for the products and services that it provides. So whatever part of its process she outsources, she remains responsible. And we may need to consider the processes when establishing the audit scope and plan. Many different situations can occur, and this, you can have total outsourcing of production. You can have a service organization that only works with contracted people and contracted firms. You have organizations that only outsource in peak situations, or small processes of the product are outsourced. So the first thing to have in mind, we can't apply a generic rule and say, this is the law. We have to analyze things, or in this sector, it is like this. For this outsourced service, it's like this. So we have to analyze situations one by one. So the first thing to remember, an outsourced process is always an externally provided process, service, or product. So there are requirements to deal with externally provided processes. They are in 8.4. And so the organization needs to consider this and to handle this according to this section. Of course, that maybe she needs, when she handles that process, to consider certain requirements of the standard. For example, requirements related to inspection, or requirements related to validation, or and we'll talk about it later. So here, a risk-based approach is needed to determine the impact of the outsourced processes in the intended outcomes of the QMS, and to define the audit plan. Many things are outsourced and can be easily audited, the controls checked, and don't need really a very big care. But others really have a big impact in the product and service, and so the sample and the time we spend in these processes will vary. It's also important to notice that outsourcing may be operating inside of facilities or outside. So in many situations, we even might not realize that there is outsourcing going on. If the company doesn't tell us, maybe they have a group of stores and the personnel there is all outsourced and trained and doesn't have a contract. But in the end, it is included in the QMS. It has access to the same, it is integrated, and we audit it. So there's no really an issue to the audit scope. But sometimes they are not there, and they cannot be audited, and so we need to go to the other side, to go to the risk approach and see if we need, what the organization does to control these processes, and if that is done in a proper manner. Let me just give you some examples. For example, we have a company, and this is common. They used to manufacture, but now they contract their manufacturing processes, and they no longer manufacture. They have several providers. They order the production. They have the requirements for their products. They have a process to control these outsourced processes, and the products and services. A scope statement that would tell product X, and these products, provision of these products would be acceptable. We are saying she's able to provide the products. Or if she wants to be more detailed, management of outsourced manufacturing and provision of products X and of these products. It would not be so common, but it would be acceptable if the organization wants to state that it makes the management of outsourced manufacturing. What would not be acceptable, or what could be considered misleading, and you must think about the risk of a customer telling, oh, you have a certificate and you say this company manufactures these products, and they even don't have the equipment or the process to do it. So you couldn't say manufacture of these products. That would be considered misleading, and it would be a risk to make this statement. But it's important to say that it's a situation of total outsourcing. Many organizations manufacture parts, outsource others. So it's not an easy black and white situation. It's black and white, but there's no manufacture. The other situation, for example, think about it's similar to this one. You make the design and development of collections. You sell these collections worldwide. You don't have plants. You have a good providers for these collections. You sell them. You order this production. You control it well. So you could perfectly say that you make design, production, and commercialization of fashion clothes collection. You make all the production. You ensure to your client the products will be delivered. You could also, like in the other example, state, if you want to, that management of outsourced manufacturing. But once again, it would be misleading to state that you design, manufacture, and trade fashion clothes and commercialize or sell fashion clothes, because in fact, the auditor didn't saw any manufacturing process. Finally, let's talk a little bit about applicability. Applicability is a new concept in ISO 9001-2015, and that was replacing the concept of exclusions, allowed exclusions. That and this was an improvement in the standard to make it clear that in principle everything is applicable. The standard was designed to be so that everything can be applicable to an organization. And this full QMS comprises all these requirements. But they also consider that there are situations where, in fact, the organization doesn't need to apply those requirements because they don't do it. But important to say is that they only can claim conformity to ISO 9001 if the requirements they determine are not applicable, do not affect their organization ability or responsibility to ensure the conformity of its products and services and the enhancement of customer satisfaction. And this is clear in the standards. Okay, I can claim I don't need to apply, but I can't affect my ability to deliver this product. So it's very important for auditors to understand Annex A5, where a good clarification on this concept is done. And it's also very good if you have discussions during the audit about this. It's also a very good reminder and a very good text to clarify things with the audit. Examples of commonly justified non-applicabilities. I give an example of a barber shop, but it could be another. It was just to provide a simple example. They have no measuring equipment that needs traceability. They don't need. They don't have measuring needs that need to trace the equipment to an international standard measure. Or, for example, the same with an inspection services that only uses visual control. So 715 would not be applicable. Many organizations not handle customer or supplier property, so they will even we have to consider customer information and customer data, but even that they don't need to handle. So they wouldn't need to apply clause 853. The same, for example, think about, and this is common, there's a police department that is an organization that is part of a bigger organization. And in fact, for example, she doesn't select the provision because this is who are the suppliers, because this is done at a higher level of authority. And this higher level of authority might not be covered with this KMS, but with other one. So she wouldn't select the provider, so she wouldn't apply part of 8.41, but in fact, she would still need to monitor the provision of this of the services and products. So this is also very important. In many clauses of the standard, the organization may not apply all requirements that are there, but there are parts of the requirements that are still applicable. And the other one, and very common for very different reasons, is that an organization that the non-applicability of clause 83. And there's a situation where it's perfectly justifiable. It's that they don't do it. There's another organization that does it. The product comes perfectly defined. The requirements of the product or the service come perfectly defined by the customer. And there's no further development needed. You just need to provide a service or to make the product. No need to develop or to design anything. One thing that is important is that you cannot accept a clause or a requirement is not applicable because it's outsourced. That is not a motive, because if the responsibility is with the organization, so it's not, for example, you might outsource design and development, but it's not for that you exclude. For example, you may outsource a process, a welding process, that requires a validation process. It's not by that reason that you will exclude the validation of process. And it's important also that, of course, in outsourcing, you're going to use a lot of 8.4 to know how the organization define the controls to the outsourced processes. But if these outsourced processes have defined requirements within the standard, you need also to see how the organization addresses these requirements to ensure the external provider can comply with these requirements and that he is comfortable that and how they control that he's complying. And for example, outsourcing is very frequent in design and development, and not only outsourcing, but other kind of relationships like partnerships, collaboration, and so it's very common that design, and more common that design and development is not done in the organization alone. So what you need to and that is not a reason for consider it not applicable. We still need to audit if they have adequate and competent control over the activities. And so we should not validate non-applicability. And the other thing is that even because it's outsourced, this case, some requirements and in other cases may not be applicable, but some of them will certainly be. The APG paper, there's a specific APG paper on design and development, and this gives a detailed explanation on how to audit design and development, that there are many different types of design and development processes and needs. Some processes are very complex, others are very simple. So you need to adapt to all situations, which doesn't imply that you have a simple design process you don't consider it non-applicable. One of the things we needed to clarify, and this was a specific request from several CBs was the implication of the new concept of applicability and scope. Because now, on the other version, although that was not the intention, in practice, an organization could exclude a requirement and could exclude design and developing, arguing that it didn't need to do it. It could be true or false, but it was difficult to argue that, to justify that she shouldn't. Not in all situations it was clear that she could exclude or not. But now, in principle, she can argue everything is applicable. I don't exclude anything. And I don't have any justification. But in the end, the fact that it considers applicable doesn't mean that it can demonstrate that it applied. So, okay, it doesn't exclude. It considers design and development applicable. Okay, and show me how you design and develop your processes. And at the moment that the audit, I cannot demonstrate. I consider it applicable, but when my product needs changes or I need to introduce a new product or new service, I will change it. This is common. This is common for several reasons. One of them is that it was usual to exclude 7.3. And this is as long historical reasons that come back to even before ISO 9001-2008. And one of the reasons why we changed the concept from exclusions to applicability was to address this difficulty for organizations to consider the application of all requirements. But now they are considering, and people are more and more aware of the importance of design and development, because it really is an early stage to identify problems and to ensure success of the new products or changes in products. So now organizations are more interested in having good design and development processes, and the standard clarifies more. So this is one of the situations. The other is that, in fact, the products or the services are stable, are common, don't change a lot, and don't have a few changes. So it's not regular. Okay, maybe I will change my product in a few years because of this and that, but it's not something I do. I don't launch new products, and mine don't change significantly a lot. And another one that is not so obvious is that usually it's not required. There might be changes in customer needs, but I can deal them with a good analysis of the requirements, with a good planning of the provision of product and service. I don't need to set a design and development processes for these changes that might be on a one-by-one case. But in the end, sometimes requirements, and this is especially important for the services, but for the products too, are driven by changes in technology, infrastructure, and this does not occur directly or frequently. But for example, you have a certain service based on you have a kind of analysis based on a certain equipment in healthcare. If the equipment changes, if you buy a new equipment that has a new protocol, maybe the service, the interface with your client will change a lot. But this is not, and you have to design and develop, or you have to do a new infrastructure, and many requirements of the service, many legal requirements for that service or that product are in the infrastructure itself. So this is not so obvious, but should be analyzed by the auditor, because it doesn't occur frequently, but when it occurs, the future impact on the service or product is big. And maybe the organization is losing an opportunity to do a very good job. And usually there are many organizations, and this is usual in construction, they only build according to what the architecture and civil engineer does. They don't design and develop. But sometimes there are organizations that need to consider there are contracts where they need to design and develop, or in other sectors where it's not common, but the circumstances change. Okay, this is all acceptable, but one thing we have to have in mind, to include the design and development, we need not only to determine its applicability, and the organization claims, okay, it's applicable, but I don't need to apply it now, but also needs to demonstrate it. And this is in the scope of the standard. The organization will certify a scope for products and services that the organization demonstrates that has the ability to provide. So if she can't demonstrate that she has the ability to design and develop a product and service using a defined process of the KMAs, and she can't provide evidences, we shouldn't put design and development on the scope statement. So always a scope statement that includes the process design and development demonstrated evidence of its effective application. And this comes from the scope of the standard. Nonetheless, you might not have design and development on the scope statement, and you still consider design and development applicable. There's no problem with that. Finally, one thing, and this is more, it has always been true, but it's more and more true. Scope changes with time and circumstances, and organizations need to revise it and update it, and consequently, it needs to be audited regularly. Even if products and services are the same, there are changes in processes, there are changes in infrastructure, changes in other resources, and in the end, locations. And these might have implications in the products and service themselves and in scope definition. So in every audit, the auditor has to validate the scope and to see if there are relevant change. And things that the company does today might stop doing in the future, and new services come, or and you might be, and you need to be aware of these changes. For example, now that a lot of companies start to sell online and deliver its products by mail. So they're not just selling the products, they are providing also a new service. And there is a new service that is created. So it's going back to the applicability of design and development. This is a clear situation where design and development should be considered, and many organizations don't find it not applicable, and in the end they launch a new service, and so you would need to verify these to see how they are doing in performing this new process, and to revise the scope statement. The other example I gave previously is the construction company that that needs to for a specific contract, that needs to have design and development, and maybe they make a joint venture with other company, they outsource the process, and then they have to include the process in the scope. But then the process is over, and 1 year, 2 years after, they don't have more demonstrated ability to make design and development. And in fact, you should remove this process from the scope. I hope this information. Thanks for watching, and I give the word to Michael.
Well, thank you again, Joana dos Guimarães Sá, for that terrific overview of the scope and applicability of ISO 9001:2015. And that concludes this presentation.